April 10, 1943. Naval Air Station, Quonset Point, Rhode Island. The teletype machine clattered out an urgent message from Pacific Fleet Headquarters. Japanese night harassment increasing. Guadalcanal reports severe troop exhaustion from sleep deprivation. Fleet requires immediate countermeasures. Establish night fighter capability, Priority 1. Lieutenant Commander William J. Widhelm reviewed the orders, establishing VF-75, the United States Navy's first dedicated night fighter squadron. 18 pilots, 6 ground officers, 30 enlisted men. Of the pilots, only 5 had instrument flying experience. 3 had checked out in Corsairs. The rest had flown nothing more advanced than SNJ trainers. What began as a desperate response to Japanese nocturnal harassment would evolve into the most revolutionary transformation in carrier aviation history. Within 18 months, American night fighters would achieve such complete dominance that Japanese pilots would choose certain death in daylight over facing the invisible hunters that ruled the darkness. The Pacific War had exposed a critical vulnerability in American naval aviation. Since August 1942, Japanese aircraft had perfected a simple but devastating tactic. Single aircraft, often antiquated float planes, would appear over American positions throughout the night. The pilots deliberately desynchronized their engines, creating a distinctive thrumming sound that earned them the nickname Washing Machine Charlie from exhausted Marines on Guadalcanal. Sometimes they dropped bombs, sometimes just flares. Often, they simply circled for hours, engines droning, keeping thousands of men awake and degrading combat effectiveness through systematic sleep deprivation. The Imperial Japanese Navy had recognized early that they could not match American industrial production or daylight fighter performance. Their response was tactical innovation that weaponized the night itself. Japanese naval aviators underwent rigorous screening for night vision capability from the moment of recruitment. The best were assigned to specialized units flying obsolete aircraft that would have been death traps in daylight but became psychological weapons in darkness. Against this threat, American forces were effectively helpless. Army Air Force P-70 night fighters had reached Guadalcanal in February 1943, but proved inadequate, their ceiling too low, their radar primitive, their effectiveness minimal. The solution emerged from an unlikely collaboration between naval officers and civilian scientists at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Radiation Laboratory. Project Affirm, established in April 1942 under Commander Weg Taylor, had been working to adapt British radar technology for naval aviation use. The breakthrough came with development of the AN/APS-4 and later AN/APS-6 airborne intercept radar. Marvels of miniaturization that compressed ship-based radar and capabilities into pods small enough to mount on single-seat fighters. The AN/APS-6 represented a quantum leap in capability. Operating at 3.2 centimeter wavelength, it could detect fighter-sized targets at 4 miles and track them to within 50 yards. The system offered 2 modes: search, where targets appeared as dots on a 2-inch display showing range and bearing, and gun sight, which provided precise steering cues for weapons employment. But the technology was only part of the equation. Flying and fighting in absolute darkness required complete reimagining of fighter tactics developed over decades of daylight combat. The aircraft selected for modification was initially the Vought F4U Corsair. 34 F4U-2 variants were produced by field modification at Naval Aircraft Factory Philadelphia and Naval Air Station San Diego, with radar equipment installed in a streamlined fairing on the starboard wing. The cockpit was extensively modified, with red lighting to preserve night vision, additional instruments for blind flying, and the radar scope positioned where the pilot could monitor it while maintaining aircraft control. Later, the Grumman F6F Hellcat would become the primary night fighter, with F6F-3 Newtons and F6F-5 Newtons variants eventually dominating carrier operations. Training for night combat pushed human capabilities to extraordinary limits. At the newly established Night Fighter Training Unit at Naval Auxiliary Air Facility, Charlestown, Rhode Island, instructors recreated carrier operations in complete darkness. Runways were marked with dim lights, simulating carrier decks. Arresting gear stretched across concrete. From sunset to sunrise, the entire base operated in blackout conditions. Pilots learned to trust instruments when every instinct screamed danger, to interpret radar returns while flying complex intercept patterns, to land on simulated carrier decks guided only by barely visible signals. The washout rate exceeded 60%. Those who survived emerged as a new breed of naval aviator, capable of operating in conditions that experienced pilots considered suicidal. Lieutenant John Phillips, an engineering graduate who had abandoned Bell Laboratories for naval aviation, explained the challenge to new students. Forget everything you know about dogfighting. At night, there are no second chances. The pilot who sees first, shoots first, survives. The one who hesitates, dies. On October 31st, 1943, Lieutenant Hugh D. O'Neill Jr. made history. Flying from Munda, New Georgia, he intercepted a Mitsubishi G-4M Betty bomber 12 miles southeast of the Shortland Islands. It was the first victory for VF-75 and proved that radar-equipped fighters could successfully engage enemy aircraft in total darkness. The psychological impact on both sides was immediate. Japanese air crews, who had operated with impunity for over a year, suddenly faced an invisible threat. American forces, tormented by nightly harassment, finally had an effective defense. The expansion of night fighter capabilities accelerated rapidly. VF-76, commissioned on February 1st, 1944, followed by VF-77, VF-78, and additional squadrons that would eventually number 14. Each unit developed tactical innovations shared through detailed after-action reports. What emerged was sophisticated doctrine that transformed night fighting from desperate improvisation to precise science. Lieutenant Commander Richard E. Harmer, commanding VF-101, demonstrated the evolution during the Marshall Islands campaign. On the night of January 29, 1944, his squadron deployed from USS Enterprise, flying F4U-2 Corsairs, the first carrier-based night fighter combat mission. Near Taroa, Harmer intercepted a Betty bomber using tactics impossible without radar. Instead of traditional pursuit, he climbed above the target, using altitude advantage to control the engagement. When he dove to attack, the Japanese crew never saw him coming. The bomber exploded after a single firing pass. Victim to technology and tactics, the Japanese could neither match nor counter. The technical challenges of carrier night operations were staggering. Landing on a pitching deck in daylight required exceptional skill. Performing the same task in darkness, guided only by dim lights and landing signal officer paddles, pushed pilots beyond normal human limits. Initial accident rates exceeded 30%. Barriers failed to stop aircraft that missed arresting wires. Crashed aircraft turned flight decks into infernos. But procedures evolved rapidly. Pilots developed precise communication protocols, calling out altitude and distance to maintain spacing without visual reference. Fuel minimums were established. Any aircraft with less than 200 pounds remaining would ditch alongside destroyers rather than risk a deck crash. Japanese attempts to counter American night fighters revealed the depth of their technological deficit. Intelligence reports, intercepted by Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, documented emergency conferences where senior naval aviators debated responses. Some advocated abandoning night operations entirely. Others proposed primitive radar warning receivers that might detect American fighters. But Japan's electronics industry, already strained by wartime demands, could not match American production. While Westinghouse alone manufactured over 2,000 radar sets, Japanese firms managed fewer than 50 airborne units during the entire war, most too unreliable for combat use. The transformation accelerated with introduction of the F6F-3 Newton's Hellcat in early 1944. More stable than the Corsair and with better deck handling characteristics, the Hellcat proved ideal for night carrier operations. Squadrons developed new tactics, exploiting radar capabilities. Radar pickets positioned fighters at specific points, creating invisible barriers through which no enemy aircraft could pass undetected. Hunter-killer teams used one fighter to track targets, while another maintained visual lookout. Ship-based fighter directors learned to vector multiple intercepts simultaneously, stacking fighters at different altitudes to create impenetrable defensive screens. Commander Turner F. Caldwell represented the next evolutionary leap. A visionary who had lobbied persistently for dedicated night carrier operations, Caldwell argued that mixing day and night fighters on conventional carriers compromised both. His solution was revolutionary: convert an entire carrier exclusively for night operations. On August 15, 1944, his vision materialized when Night Air Group 41 embarked aboard USS Independence, the world's first dedicated night carrier. The conversion was comprehensive. Independence received additional radar systems, providing unprecedented situational awareness. Flight deck lighting was reconfigured for minimal visibility. Maintenance schedules inverted, with primary operations in darkness and repairs during daylight. The air group consisted of VFN-41, with 14 F6F-5 Newtons Hellcats, and VT-41, with 12 radar-equipped TBM Avengers. Every aspect, from crew training to meal schedules, optimized for nocturnal operations. On September 12, 1944, Night Air Group 41 conducted its first offensive sweep over the Philippines. The mission profile was audacious. Arrive over enemy territory at dusk, orbit airfields, and destroy any aircraft attempting night operations. Lieutenant William E. Henry led the fighter sweep, maintaining formation integrity through radar while navigating by dead reckoning. At 21:45 hours, his scope showed multiple contacts rising from Clark Field. The Japanese aircraft, expecting routine harassment missions, flew predictably. Henry's coordinated attack destroyed 6 aircraft in 3 minutes. Surviving Japanese pilots scattered in panic. Some collided in darkness. Others crashed attempting emergency landings without runway lights. By mission's end, Night Group 41 claimed 14 aerial victories and 20 ground kills without loss. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 demonstrated night fighters' strategic impact. As Japanese naval forces attempted their final decisive engagement, American night fighters flew continuous patrols, preventing enemy reconnaissance. Lieutenant Edward Chastain, of VF-41, intercepted 3 scout planes searching for Task Force 38 on October 24th. Without accurate position reports, Japanese fleet elements blundered into uncoordinated engagements, resulting in catastrophic defeat. Night fighters had evolved from defensive necessities to offensive enablers. The technological sophistication continued advancing. The APS-6, a radar in late-war F6 F-5 Newton's fighters, could detect targets at 6 miles and track multiple contacts simultaneously. IFF identification, friend or foe systems prevented friendly fire incidents that had plagued early operations. VHF radios allowed precise communication between fighters and controllers hundreds of miles apart. Even small details mattered. Specially designed red goggles preserved night vision while allowing pilots to read instruments, while Japanese aviators improvised with makeshift solutions. Training programs reflected American industrial advantages. The Night Attack and Combat Training Unit at Charlestown graduated 50 pilots monthly. Instructors were combat veterans who returned from the Pacific to share expertise. Synthetic training devices, including primitive flight simulators, allowed practice without burning precious fuel. Meanwhile, Japanese training collapsed under fuel shortages and loss of experienced instructors. New pilots arrived at combat units with less than 100 hours total flight time, no night training, and obsolete aircraft lacking radar. Lieutenant Commander James S. Gray, commanding VF-78, exemplified the new generation of night fighter tacticians. Operating from USS Intrepid, Gray developed the loose juice formation. 2 fighters operating independently, but within mutual support range. This seemingly simple innovation doubled coverage area while reducing collision risk. On August 31, 1944, Gray damaged a Betty bomber 90 miles east of Iwo Jima, beginning a campaign that would claim multiple victories for his squadron. Night Air Group 90 replaced Air Group 41 aboard Enterprise in December 1944, representing further evolution in capabilities. Commanded by Lieutenant Commander William R. Winston, VF-90 flew the newest F6F-5 Newton's fighters with improved APS-6A radar. The squadron had completed over 3,000 practice intercepts at Barbers Point, Hawaii. Winston introduced revolutionary barrier patrol tactics, positioning fighters to create overlapping coverage zones, making penetration virtually impossible. On January 12, 1945, during Operations supporting the Lingayen Gulf invasion. VF-90 demonstrated complete American night supremacy. Multiple waves of Japanese aircraft attempted to attack the invasion fleet after dark. Winston's fighters, vectored by ship-based controllers using sophisticated radar plotting, achieved perfect positioning for every intercept. Lieutenant John Morris destroyed 3 bombers in a single pass, his 6 machine guns converging at precisely calculated range. Lieutenant William Levering shot down 2 torpedo bombers while flying below 100 feet altitude, using radar altimeter to avoid the ocean while tracking targets against sea clutter. The mathematics were devastating. That single night, American night fighters claimed 43 confirmed victories against 0 losses. Post-war Japanese records revealed that of 197 aircraft launched, only 34 returned operational. The psychological impact was crushing. Lieutenant Commander Susumu Kimura, one of few survivors, testified, "We could not see American fighters, but they saw us perfectly. Like fighting ghosts with machine guns, the darkness we had mastered became our grave." Production statistics revealed the industrial chasm. Between March 1944 and August 1945, American factories produced over 26,000 radar sets and 2,000 AN/APS-6 units. Japanese electronics firms managed fewer than 50 primitive airborne radars, most failing after minimal use. American carriers received continuous upgrades, improved radar, better radios, refined instruments. Japanese units cannibalized wrecked aircraft for spare parts, a downward spiral accelerating toward complete collapse. The broader naval campaign demonstrated night fighters' strategic value. Japanese inability to conduct reconnaissance meant American fleet movements remained concealed until attack commenced. This operational surprise contributed decisively to victories at Philippine Sea, where night fighters prevented Japanese scouts from locating Task Force 58 until the Marianas Turkey Shoot was already underway. At Okinawa, continuous night fighter patrols rendered Japanese airfields unusable after dark, compressing enemy operations into daylight hours, where they faced overwhelming American superiority. Weather emerged as unexpected ally. Japanese doctrine emphasized clear conditions for visual navigation. American radar-equipped fighters operated effectively in clouds, rain, and fog that grounded enemy aircraft. Several major raids were disrupted, not by combat, but by weather that Americans penetrated while Japanese could not. The all-weather capability multiplied effective operational tempo, allowing continuous pressure regardless of conditions. Individual squadrons developed unique innovations. VF-91, operating from USS Hornet, pioneered intruder missions, single fighters penetrating Japanese airspace to attack aircraft during takeoff and landing. These missions required extraordinary navigation skills, as pilots flew hundreds of miles over water in darkness to arrive over enemy airfields at precisely calculated times. Lieutenant Robert Holden demonstrated the tactic's effectiveness on April 14, 1945, destroying 3 aircraft over Kanoya Airfield and returning safely despite intense anti-aircraft fire. The Japanese perspective, revealed through post-war interrogations and captured documents, showed growing desperation. Admiral Soimu Toyoda admitted, "American night fighters destroyed our capability for offensive operations after dark. We could neither attack their ships nor defend our bases. The sanctuary of darkness became our tomb. Junior officers reported veteran pilots feigning illness rather than fly night missions, knowing that radar-equipped Hellcats meant almost certain death. VT -90. The torpedo squadron component of Night Air Group 90 demonstrated that night capabilities extended beyond fighters. Flying radar-equipped TBM-3E Avengers, they conducted night torpedo attacks, mine-laying operations, and even achieved aerial victories. Lieutenant Charles Henderson claimed 4 aircraft destroyed, including a Kawanishi H-8K flying boat, proving that night combat effectiveness was not limited to specialized fighters. The technological progression continued accelerating. Plans existed for F6, F6 Newtons variants with more powerful engines and advanced APS-12 radar capable of tracking targets at 10 miles. The F4U-5 Newtons Corsair was entering production with performance exceeding any Japanese aircraft. Jet-powered night fighters were on drawing boards. The atomic bombs that ended the war also ended these development programs, but the foundation for all future night combat aviation had been established. Training accidents provided harsh lessons that improved procedures continuously. The collision of 2 Hellcats over USS Randolph on January 18, 1945, led to mandatory altitude separation for night formations. The loss of Lieutenant Commander Robert Campbell's entire division during night training on December 3, 1944, resulted in new weather minimums for group operations. Each tragedy contributed to institutional knowledge that saved future lives. Despite higher training costs and equipment complexity, night fighters achieved kill ratios exceeding daylight fighters, approximately 18-1 for night fighters versus 11-1 for day fighters by 1945. The psychological impact reduced enemy operations more effectively than attrition alone. The cultural transformation within naval aviation was profound. Night fighter pilots, initially viewed with suspicion by traditional squadrons, earned respect through demonstrated effectiveness. Their specialized skills, instrument flying, radar interpretation, radio coordination became mandatory for all naval aviators post-war. The night fighter campaign had proven that modern air combat required technical proficiency equaling or exceeding traditional flying skills. The cowboy era of intuitive flying was ending. The age of the systems operator had begun. Logistics supporting night operations were immense. Radar sets required specialized maintenance by electronics technicians rather than traditional mechanics. Spare parts traveled thousands of miles across the Pacific, protected from corrosive salt air. Special red light bulbs, radar scopes, electronic components each required separate supply chains. The success of night fighters represented logistics triumph as much as tactical innovation. On May 13, 1945, VF-41 achieved a milestone when Lieutenant J.R. Smith became the squadron's 5th ace, with 7 confirmed night victories. This concentration of expertise in a single squadron, 5 aces among 14 pilots, demonstrated the lethal efficiency achieved through specialized training and superior equipment. By comparison, Japanese night fighter units lacking radar and adequate training rarely achieved even single victories against American bombers. The influence extended beyond naval aviation. Marine Night Fighter Squadron, VMF, -513, trained by Navy instructors and equipped with Navy-developed radar, achieved remarkable success from shore bases. Army Air Force squadrons adopted Navy procedures and equipment, reversing the typical inter-service rivalry. The Night Fighter campaign had created a brotherhood of pilots who shared unique skills transcending service boundaries. Environmental factors unique to the Pacific required constant adaptation. Tropical thunderstorms could destroy aircraft as effectively as enemy fighters. Bioluminescent plankton stirred by ship wakes revealed fleet positions to alert enemies. The vast distances meant fuel management often determined mission success, more than combat skill. Each factor required specific tactical adaptations, accumulating into comprehensive doctrine applicable worldwide. The final months of war saw American night dominance so complete that Japanese naval aviation essentially abandoned nocturnal operations. VF-103 aboard USS Bonhomme Richard flew patrols in July 1945 without encountering any enemy aircraft. None dared fly after dark. The transformation from helpless victims of Washing Machine Charlie to absolute masters of darkness had taken less than 2 years, a revolution in military affairs comparable to the introduction of radar itself. On July 29, 1945, Lieutenant Robert Holden of VF-91 conducted what would be the final night fighter engagement of the Pacific War. Intercepting a Yokosuka P-1Y reconnaissance aircraft attempting to photograph the invasion fleet, Holden pursued for 7 minutes through violent, evasive maneuvers that would have succeeded against any daylight fighter. But radar maintained lock throughout, and his guns found their mark. The Francis plunged into the ocean, taking with it the last remnants of Japanese night aviation capability. Statistical analysis was staggering. Between April 1943 and August 1945, American carrier-based night fighters claimed 579 confirmed aerial victories against 32 operational losses, a kill ratio of 18-1. Japanese night operations, which had tormented American forces throughout 1942 and early 1943, had been so thoroughly suppressed that personnel arriving in theater after mid-1944 never experienced night attacks. The psychological warfare Japan had wielded effectively for 2 years had been turned against them with devastating efficiency. Post-war evaluation by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey concluded that night fighters had contributed disproportionately to the greed collapse of Japanese air power. By denying enemy forces the sanctuary of darkness, American fighters compressed Japanese operations into daylight hours, where they faced overwhelming numerical and qualitative superiority. The psychological impact was equally significant. Japanese pilots, knowing that neither darkness nor weather offered protection, suffered morale collapse manifesting in increased accidents, desertions, and refusal to fly combat missions. Individual courage of night fighter pilots deserved special recognition. Unlike daylight fighters who could see threats approaching, night fighter pilots lived in constant uncertainty, never knowing whether the next radar contact was enemy or friendly, whether their next landing would be successful or fatal. The accident rate for night operations remained triple that of daylight throughout the war. Yet volunteers never wavered. Commander Caldwell's Night Air Group 41 exemplified this dedication. In 7 months of combat from Independence, the squadron flew 1,743 sorties, logged 4,892 combat hours, claimed 46 aerial victories. 5 pilots became aces, including Lieutenant William Henry, with 7 victories, despite being shot down twice and spending 18 hours in life rafts. The squadron's loss rate of 27% was considered acceptable by night fighter standards, testament to extraordinary dangers these pioneers faced nightly. The technological legacy extended far beyond military applications. Miniaturized radar systems developed for night fighters enabled civilian aviation to operate safely in all-weather conditions. Precise navigation techniques required for night intercepts contributed to modern air traffic control development. Even red lighting, preserving night vision, became standard in applications from astronomy to medicine. The night fighter campaign had driven innovation, benefiting all humanity. The broader implications for military doctrine were profound and lasting. Night fighting demonstrated that technological superiority could completely overturn traditional military advantages. The Japanese Navy had spent decades developing night combat expertise, selecting and training personnel specifically for darkness operations. American forces, starting from zero capability in early 1943, achieved absolute dominance within 18 months through superior equipment and adaptive doctrine. The lesson was clear. In modern warfare, technological adaptation trumped traditional expertise. Leadership at squadron level proved crucial. Lieutenant Commander Russell Reeserer, who later commanded VF-76, instituted rigorous training, requiring each pilot to complete 50 practice intercepts before attempting combat missions. His insistence on perfection before engagement resulted in his squadron achieving 23 victories without a single operational loss to enemy action, an unprecedented achievement in aerial combat. This emphasis on thorough preparation became standard throughout night fighter squadrons. The industrial foundation of success extended beyond radar manufacturing. Grumman modified production lines to accommodate night fighter variants without disrupting daylight fighter output. Specialized training aircraft were developed, including radar-equipped SNJ trainers with hooded cockpits for instrument practice. Even seemingly minor items like luminous instrument paint required industrial mobilization that Japan, with its resource constraints and damaged infrastructure, could not match. As dawn broke on August 15, 1945, Lieutenant Commander Winston led the final night fighter patrol of World War II. His Hellcat circled above Task Force 38, radar scanning empty skies for enemies who no longer came. The transformation was complete and irreversible. Less than 28 months earlier, American forces had cowered helplessly under Japanese night attacks, exhausted and demoralized by an enemy they could neither see nor stop. Now, as morning light revealed defeated Japan, American night fighters owned the darkness so completely that enemy pilots chose death over encountering them. The statistics told only part of the story. Yes, 579 victories against 32 losses was remarkable. Yes, 14 squadrons from zero in 2 years represented extraordinary expansion. But the true victory was psychological and doctrinal. America had proven that technological innovation, properly applied, could overturn any traditional military advantage. The nation that better integrated science with warfare would prevail regardless of warrior tradition or individual courage. In the pre-dawn darkness of August 15, 1945, the radar scope in Winston's Hellcat showed nothing but empty sky. The Japanese pilots, who had once terrorized American forces with impunity, were gone, destroyed not just physically, but psychologically by an enemy that had transformed their sanctuary into a hunting ground. Admiral John S. McCain, Jr., reflecting on the campaign, observed, "We entered the war, unable to defend against even primitive night harassment. We ended it with such complete mastery that enemy pilots preferred capture to flying after dark." This transformation, achieved in less than 2 years during wartime conditions, represents one of the most remarkable adaptations in military history. The legacy influenced military aviation for generations. Korean War night operations built directly on Pacific experience. Vietnam's night campaigns used procedures developed over Guadalcanal and Leyte. Modern stealth aircraft, designed for undetected penetration of enemy airspace, trace conceptual ancestry to radar-equipped Hellcats that first made darkness an American domain. The revolution begun in 1943 continues shaping aerial warfare today. The night belonged to America, and with it, the future of aerial warfare had been forever transformed. Japanese pilots could not escape America's carrier-based night fighters because the Americans had done the impossible. They had learned to see in the dark.